At the heart of Willesden High School, a secret lurks in the shadows. Join us as we uncover the mystery of descendants of witches as Olivia's world falls apart, and the lines between reality and nightmare blur. What is real and what is the work of evil? Let's find out. Here is Descendants of Witches EP22. Thank you for your likes and subscriptions. Hope to see your comments in the comment section. 2. 46 The Devil September 17, 1946 After school Jutta. To Carter's surprise, his voice came out muffled. Strange liquid entered his parted mouth and the salt lit his taste buds on fire. Carter furrowed his eyebrows and firmly pressed his lips, yet water continued to leak into his mouth. He confusedly fluttered his eyes open, and bubbles flooded his vision. Carter sucked the air that remained within his body, but it still did not replace the ocean that enveloped him. The water that surrounded him was cloudy, chlorinated and colder than the clothes that clung onto his body. The fluid grazed every inch of his skin and entered his lungs, much to his discomfort. Every sore and bruise stung when the salt caressed his body. He twisted his body to the right while clutching onto his bruised elbow, and outstretched his free hand to grab onto land. There was no land. Carter squinted with confusion as he gazed at the world below him. His eyes widened when all he could see was dark and angry indigo swirls. He swiveled his head skyward, and looming above him was the menacing turquoise hues he once thought were beautiful. Carter gulped nervously and water trickled down his throat at this action. He was floating within the ocean currents, like a piece of useless seaweed, drifting away from the shoreline. First it was peaceful. Everything was hazy when he awoke because his memories had been temporarily washed out by the water. As soon as he realized where he was, his head began pounding and every cell in his body suddenly screamed for oxygen. The cold water pushed him down and closed around him, making it impossible to swim upwards. His brain fuzzed with the onset of chlorine surging through his veins, and he couldn't think properly. From the edge of his glossy vision, two hands dipped into the water and stretched towards the sinking Carter. Carter didn't have time to question the logistics of the situation, and whether someone could save him when he was this deep in. He eagerly grabbed onto the hands, which were surprisingly warm considering their surroundings. All his shivering mind could think about was the blessing that seemed to be gifted from heaven. The hands hauled him up, and perhaps his sense of distance was astray because if he was as far in as he thought he was, the lift to the surface wouldn't be this quick. Yet it was, so he assumed what he thought was a miscalculated measure. Carter gulped the sweet air as soon as his head emerged above the water, thankful that he was privileged enough to have oxygen. His lungs drank the abundant air in noisy rasps as he was pulled to what he thought was the shore. Carter lifted his drenched lashes and blinked rapidly before his blurred vision cleared. What he saw in front of him was not a sandy beach but a sight he never thought he would see again. The pool room with a shirtless Jutta sitting on the wet floor. Jutta's hands were curled around Carter's wrist, as he sat on the ledge of the swimming pool. Carter gasped with relief when his brain registered the boy, and he eagerly placed a foot on the stepladder. Before Carter could haul his shivering body out of the pool, Jutta jerked him forward, so that the sharp ledge pressed against his chest and he was off the stepladder. Carter brushed aside his confusion towards the boy's surprisingly violent action and smiled at him instead. "Jutta, I'm so glad you're here," he exclaimed, sweeping strands of his damp hair that covered his eyes. Carter glanced around the pool room, hoping to see the others. Unfortunately, the room was empty, but it was not the same as they had left it. Carter squinted into the horizon and realized Jimmy's corpse wasn't where they had left it. The pool room itself was much different than he recalled. It was the cleanest it had ever been. The water that tickled his lower body was uncommonly clear, so much so that it was impossible to gauge the depth. The walls weren't stained with gray. Rather, it was a pristine white, almost blinding Carter's eyes. The most noticeable change was the intact sidewall. Although Carter's memory was foggy, he could never forget the obliterated sidewall. It was as if they had traveled back in time, moments or even days before the events of September 17th. Everything was strangely normal compared to their current situation. "Do you know where the others are?" Carter asked, turning to face Jutta again. "I don't entirely remember, but I think we were standing off against Stevenson until he snapped his fingers and everything disappeared," Carter said, interlocking his frigid fingers with Jutta's. "I'm just glad you're here with me," he said softly, smiling at Jutta as pink dusted his cheeks. Jutta blinked at Carter owlishly. A smile was plastered on his face too, but it stretched to his ears in a thin line. Carter wanted to describe it as a lopsided grin, but he refused to believe that he was grinning. Grinning is bad, right? He's not grinning. Or maybe he is grinning but with joy. Carter frantically thought as he studied the features on Jutta's face. Everything about him was normal. His almond-shaped eyes were black, his fluffy hair was black, his swim shorts were black, and his extremely apparent six-pack abs were unchanged since the last time he saw them. Still, there was a tug at Carter's heart that told him something was off. Something was different about Jutta. "I'm not glad," Jutta bluntly said, his lips curling upwards with every shift of his mouth. Carter raised an eyebrow with confusion, but he decided not to question it any further. Anyway, we need to find the others and return to Stevenson. Remember our plan," he said, affectionately stroking his fingers against Jutta's pale skin. "I'm not glad that you're here," Jutta said simply, flashing him a creepy and uncanny grin. Carter's lower lip suddenly trembled at those words, and as much as he wanted to stop the spasm, he couldn't help it. He feebly asked, slowly retreating his hands from Jutta's grip. What do you mean?" "You know exactly what I mean," Jutta said, shrugging nonchalantly. Carter inhaled the chlorinated air sharply and attempted to stay strong, but it proved to be difficult. It was as if his words were the pain one received when another laid a knife upon their skin and drew blood. The cruelty inflicted intentionally was the worst kind of murder. "Jutta, let's just find the others, okay? Stevenson is our priority," Carter said, as he placed his foot on the stepladder. Before Carter could jump over the ledge, Jutta grabbed his shirt and jerked him towards him again. Carter groaned as his upper chest slammed into the sharp ledge. He tentatively opened one eye and stared up at Jutta, who was grinning down at him. Grinning evilly. "I'm not glad you're here, Carter," Jutta hissed, his fiery voice failing to warm Carter's ears. "Why would I be? Why did you expect me to be? Because you think I have feelings for you. That I love you," he bitterly said, his face scrunching with disgust. Carter whimpered with pain as Jutta violently pulled him upwards, so their faces were leveled. Jutta, he whispered, unable to fathom the boy that sat in front of him. "This has to be a dream. The Jutta I know would never say that. Go to hell, boy lover." As soon as the words spat out of Jutta's mouth, he pushed Carter into the pool. Carter opened his eyes in shock as the air pushed against this face. The world rushed by in a blur as he hurtled downwards. It went by fast yet slow, almost suspended. His hand instinctively reached out, grasping the endless ceiling above, hoping it would save him. As he fell, the betrayal and pain swirled around his aching heart, and he forgot about saving himself. Suspended in the air, he closed his eyes and surrendered himself to the infinite ocean below. Then he crashed into the water. The incredible pressure compressed his chest, forcing his lungs to burn as if on fire. His heart began hammering, increasing in intensity and speed, like a bird trapped in a cage. His throat seared in agony with the rising pressure of trapped air. Carter's arms and legs kicked out desperately as he tried to swim to the surface, yet he continued to drift downwards. From his lips came an explosion of air bubbles, moving away from him at a peculiar angle. He realized he wasn't facing upwards and that he was struggling perpendicular to the surface. Carter gave in to the pressure because his brain was going to explode if he didn't. He had to take a breath, there were no two ways about it. So he parted his lips and sucked the liquid around him, that he desperately wished was replaced with oxygen. For some reason it didn't hurt like he thought it would. He wasn't scared anymore and it was almost peaceful. He began to fall. As he fell further into the darkness until it threatened to swallow him whole, he allowed his mind to wander. He was going to die anyway, so he decided that he should have a final thought that would allow him to rest in peace. Jutta was all his head could come up with. Carter clenched his eyes and urged his brain to think harder. That wasn't Jutta. That was... Carter's eyes flew open when a sudden realization dawned on him. That was not Jutta. Jutta was not wearing black swim shorts the last time he saw him. That was paranormal activity. And what happened back there was his darkest fear imaginable. Jessica grudgingly lifted her head from the ground, having been awoken by a sudden jolt. As she rose from the heavy slumber, she was first aware of the coolness in the air and its loamy fragrance. Her clothes clung onto her skin and it was as damp as a flower in dew. Within seconds of realizing she was unconscious, she was on her feet, and her dreams not just forgotten but erased. Aside from her noisy breath, there was nothing to be heard and her surroundings were simply too dark to see much. At first she thought she was in the wilderness, with a canopy of trees looming overhead. To her dismay, she was stranded in the middle of the school cafeteria, which was grimmer and grayer than the rest of the school. The tables and chairs were empty, which she knew was common during after-school hours, but it still confused her eyes. She was used to seeing a cafeteria filled with bustling students, and Olivia's squad in the center of it all. Jessica roamed the cafeteria, as her legs wobbled with each step. She didn't realize how drained of energy she was until she had a few minutes to rest. Jessica glanced at the counters that were stripped of its usual lunch ladies and brown bags filled with cafeteria food. Her stomach suddenly grumbled at the sight, which startled her. Jessica suppressed her hunger by distracting herself with the more significant matters in her life. Jutta, Carter, Barbara, Jessica called, her shaky voice ringing through the empty cafeteria. Jessica stood completely still and held her breath, her ears perking up at the muffled sniffle. After a few seconds of silence, she heard another cry, this time more amplified. She slowly followed the sound and lifted her head when it was clear where the cry was coming from. The girls' washroom. Jessica outstretched her hand to push open the washroom door until a vague sense of familiarity washed over her. Just seconds before she placed her palm on the door, she knew that this had happened before, and she could predict what would happen next. No, I'm not an idiot. I know this is paranormal activity, she whispered to herself, as she pulled her hands away from the door. The cries grew louder as she stepped backwards, but Jessica forced herself to walk away. That's not Barbara crying. That's the zombie girl crying, she told herself as she placed her hands over her ears. Jessica clenched her eyes shut and she turned her back to the door. She opened her eyes and before she could continue walking away, she was face to face with herself. The girl that stood in front of her was a human, there was no other way to describe it. Her piercing blue eyes were on the real Jessica, fierce, unlike Jessica's skittish ones. The features of her face were strangely soft, like she was a broken piece of marble weathered by centuries of current. Upon closer inspection, her silky golden hair was tied up in a ragged ponytail. Jessica had to pinch herself twice to ensure that she wasn't looking into a mirror, and that what she was seeing was truly real. Jessica gulped and took a tentative step backwards. The humanoid girl did the same. Jessica retreated farther back and pressed her back against the washroom door. The figure did the same, but there was no wall behind her to lean against. She simply mirrored Jessica's outstretched hands and quivering body, which only terrified Jessica even more. It was strange seeing another being that looked and moved exactly like her. A sense of uneasiness crawled up Jessica's skin because, although the girl looked just like her, there was something uncanny about her. She was trying too hard to look and move like a human, that she forgot the essence of what makes one human. Emotion. Go away, she whispered, trembling with fear. At the sound of Jessica's voice, the girl's face began dripping, the same way an excessive amount of liquid makeup melted down Jessica's face. The girl's normal blue eyes swiftly increased in size and took up half her face. Her abnormally large pupils blinked at Jessica, the smeared mascara running down her eyelids. Her pink lipstick melted down her chin, along with her coarse frowning lips. The girl's silky blonde hair swished wildly and moments later it puffed out like a cat's tail, turning frizzy. Slowly, the girl's limbs shifted positions, as if it were made of liquid. Watching her body morph freaked Jessica out, so she screamed with pure terror. The worst part finally arrived. The girl that used to resemble Jessica shrunk down to the height of a little girl. A little zombie girl. Jessica shrieked, her eyes wide with horror, her mouth rigid and her chalky face gaunt. The zombie girl lunged forward and gripped her shoulder so that her big eyes were leveled with Jessica's. She screamed the same way Jessica screamed and blood flew from her mouth and rained onto Jessica. The zombie girl bit her neck and thick sluggish blood flowed from the wound. Jessica attempted to fight back by peeling the girl off her, but it was no use. Her hands were glued onto her, and she had no intention of letting go. Besides, it was pointless to try to fight with oneself, Jessica realized. Josh grunted as he pulled himself off the frigid ground. He eyed his surroundings and realized he was in the gymnasium. Why am I here? He confusedly thought, as he brought his hands up to his spinning head. Olivia. Ronald. Josh hesitantly called as he stumbled through the gym. Carter. Jutta. He called, gazing around the empty room. Where are you? Josh, he heard a stern female voice from behind speaking. Josh halted in his tracks and gritted his teeth. Just from hearing the tone of her voice, he knew who it was. He spun around, angrier than he was confused. Susan, he said, eyeing his mother's darkly. Susan stood with her hands on her hips and her legs spread wide apart, in a stance that was meant to intimidate Josh. It almost did. His birth mother Judith stood next to her, her sullen eyes drooping with lifelessness. Josh, where have you been? Susan inquired through gritted teeth. There was an envelope clutched in her hand. What are you doing here? Josh asked, proud of himself for mustering the strength to talk back. Why are you at my school? Josh, why are you at school? You should be home by now, doing your drills with me, Susan hissed, as she slowly stepped forward. Josh didn't know what to respond with. His memories felt like a dream and he was more confused as to how he got here in the first place. Josh, she bitterly said, her stoic voice cutting his thoughts. She passed Josh the letter that was in her hand. Read this out loud for me. It's from your football coach. Josh's eyes flew open with surprise as he trailed his fingers across the edges of the envelope. Is this? Josh looked up at Susan and Judith, who impatiently waited for him to open it. Josh frowned and crumpled the letter in his hand. No, he firmly said, as he narrowed his eyes at them. Susan chuckled with wry, which caused Josh to flinch. Josh stood his ground as Susan neared him and grabbed his shoulders violently. Read it, Josh, she demanded fiercely. No, Josh said stubbornly. I'm not an idiot, Susan. I know what this is, he added, holding up the crumpled envelope. There's no way you two would be here right now because Mr. Stevenson locked all the doors and windows. What I'm currently seeing is the paranormal activity or something of the sort, Josh proclaimed, puffing his chest outwards. You're not real. Susan simply smirked at Josh. For a second, Josh was confused. Then a pair of hands wrapped around his throat from behind. Josh stumbled backwards and kept his eyes glued onto Susan as he attempted to shake off the hands. He expected it to be her who did it, but she wasn't because she was standing in front of him, sneering down at him like a hawk. Josh twisted his head and gasped as Judith's face entered his line of vision. Her skin turned pale and the blue veins on her face became apparent, causing her to look as blue as Josh. She widened her mouth and cackled, so loudly that a trail of blood seeped from his ears. But she's supposed to be the quiet one, Josh whimpered to himself, as his tears mixed with blood. Josh cried and he attempted to pull her off, but it was no use. Judith twisted Josh and slammed him to the ground. His head jumped up at the force and collided with the floor again, worsening the bruises he had collected earlier. Judith hastily climbed on top of him, never letting go of his throat as she dug her knees into his ribcage. Susan crouched to the ground and grabbed Josh's ruddy cheeks, twisting him harshly to face her. Why haven't you been going to football practices lately, Josh? Is it because of your ugly girlfriend? Is she distracting you? She asked as her body morphed with every passing second. Her raggedy black hair swished with a menacing flare as she bared her bloody teeth at him. Judith cupped Josh's cheek and slammed his head to the right so that he was facing her. Is it because of your dirty friend? Is Ronald distracting you? She asked, her veins popping out of her forehead. Josh, they both spat as their son struggled to breathe. You know we need that scholarship, they said in unison, their dark and distorted voices merging to form a deadly tone. The scholarship, Josh. We need that scholarship. The scholarship, Josh. We need that scholarship. But I already told you. I don't want it. He shouted inwardly, unable to form a breath, let alone a word. I want Ronald to have it. Olivia plopped onto a chair, and she instinctively brought her hands up to her messy hair. She groaned with disdain as she began brushing her fingers through the knots, which only made the situation worse. Joshy. Jess. Olivia called into the darkness, confused as to how she got here in the first place. She was in a compact room, with one light bulb dangling from the ceiling on a rope. She slumped against the chair she sat on, and her back grazed against a wooden sign that had been nailed on it. Olivia's eyebrows shot up as she turned to look at the sign. It was unreadable in the darkness, so she stood up and grabbed the dangling light bulb. Discipline, it read, and Olivia squinted at it for a couple of seconds before recognizing it. Am I in the detention closet? She whispered to herself as she pointed the light bulb to her right. Sure enough, there was a clutter of lab equipment in the narrow room and one chair stood in between. The closet was clearly designed to fit one disobedient student. A queasy feeling churned in her stomach as she shivered in the darkness. Olivia continuously shone the light around the room, hoping that somehow she was able to light every corner, which she quickly found was impossible. She wished she could because there was a sense of safety in the light. From behind her, Olivia suddenly heard a clock ticking. Tick, tock. Olivia glanced behind and saw a white analog clock resting on top of a green bag. It wasn't attached to any wall and the clock hands weren't moving, but Olivia didn't notice that yet. Olivia turned around facing the closed door. She grabbed the knob and turned it, but it was locked from the other side. Surprisingly, she could hear Mrs. Briggs' boring voice drag on about some science thing. Olivia didn't have time to question it, because her voice mixed with the constant tick-tock of the clock caused Olivia's head to ache. Your mother and I are getting divorced, Olivia, she heard Mrs. Briggs's slurred voice say. Olivia suddenly blinked. Did I hear that correctly? Mrs. Briggs was suddenly talking about something unrelated to science. Olivia straightened her back, her eyes and ears alert. She tuned in to Mrs. Briggs's lecture and stood frozen. Your mother and I are getting divorced, Olivia, she said again, but this time it was a masculine voice. It was similar to her father's monotone and stern voice she was accustomed to hearing. Olivia began hyperventilating, so to stay calm she took deep breaths, just like her therapist said. Count to 3. Then take a deep breath, Olivia. Olivia jumped up and gasped, tears running down her cheeks as her pupils dilated. What? That wasn't Mrs. Briggs, that was my therapist. Am I hearing this right? Olivia frantically spun her head. She could hear her father, her therapist, and Mrs. Briggs's voice all together, talking to her in a chanting unison. In the background, the tick-tocks were increasing in tone. Suddenly, the light bulb in her hand began flickering. No, Olivia whispered, looking up at the bulb and sobbing. Not again, she screamed, placing her hands over her head as the world spun around her. Olivia gasped when the lights went completely out. She could sense something unknown lurking in the dark. Her worst fears. It was at that moment she realized that the tick-tock sounds weren't coming from the clock behind her since it wasn't attached to any wall. The strange noises were coming from someone standing on her left side, whispering in her ear. Tick, tock, her therapist hissed, his icy breath landing on her neck. Time is running out, Olivia. I can't leave you in the dark anymore, Olivia. Your mother and I are getting divorced, Olivia. Count to 3, then take a deep breath, Olivia. Don't forget to do your science homework, Olivia. Olivia let out a shrill scream, her pulse pounding in her temples. The man suddenly placed his hand over her mouth, rendering her unable to speak. He grabbed her waist with his free hand and traveled it up the hem of her skirt. Her shouts became muffled as her therapist shoved her into the chair. She could see his face more clearly now, and it was not a pleasant sight. Olivia shook her head, crying, Stop! Stop touching me! She wanted to shout as he climbed on her lap and inched his face closer towards her. It never stopped. The hand against her mouth pressed with more force. Her head became dizzy and tears stopped dripping down her face. Her body unwillingly eased against the tension, turning numb, unable to do anything in defense. All she could feel was an incredible pressure against her, a pressure she couldn't fight back against. Barbara wandered the halls of Willesden aimlessly, attempting to find her way back to the group, but unable to stop herself from wandering away. Guilt piled inside her like heavy rocks when she realized how much time had passed. She sighed as she mindlessly bent down to pick up a gray tray that happened to be in front of her. Why am I like this? Why am I so unhelpful? Barbara bit her lip and continued roaming through the school, hoping to find her friends at some intersection. She wanted to find them quickly, for fear that if she was gone for too long, they would think of her as useless. Or worse, they would forget about her. She finally arrived at a spot that seemed isolated from the rest of the school. For whatever reason, she slumped against the wall that was next to a classroom. She slid down and plopped herself on the floor. She placed the gray tray in front of her. She took a bite from the soggy sandwich that appeared on the plate. She shifted to her side and grabbed Olivia's notebook that appeared beside her. She took another bite from her sandwich. She answered another question from the notebook. The door beside her creaked an inch open. She didn't notice. She continued moving her pen. The door beside her creaked halfway open. She didn't notice. She took a bite from her sandwich. The door beside her creaked all the way open, hitting the opposite wall with a loud slam. She noticed. She dropped her sandwich. She screamed. Barbara's eyes widened with unmitigated terror. The sandwich she dropped collided with the carton of milk laying on the ground, causing it to explode all over Olivia's homework. An abnormal creature had lunged out of the classroom and was crawling towards her. Barbara shrieked as the behemoth-sized spider crept towards her. Paranormal activity. Again. Now, she exclaimed inwardly, seemingly returned to her senses. Suddenly, the spider lurched towards her and grabbed Barbara using its front legs. Barbara screamed until her throat dried up, barely able to breathe because of the suffocating pressure around her waist. She was face to face with the inscrutable spider and her core shook. The fur on the spider's lanky legs brushed against Barbara's pudgy skin, causing her face to scrunch with disgust. The spider seemed to be intelligent since it decided to mercilessly slam Barbara against the floor with a loud thump. Barbara collided with the floor, quickly accepting the fact that she had died. Her head clanged against the floor multiple times, causing her body to lose control of its nerves and blood to leak out of her auburn hair. She could only see black in her vision. Fear found her. Then fear told her something she remembered well. "Barbara, you're such a pig," it said in a distorted and ominous voice. The words brought her back to life. She gasped and fluttered her eyes open, her head spinning and her body bleeding. She was in the air and facing the spider, whose mouth was wide open after it lifted her from the ground. She could see the arrangement of its sharp fangs, and her eyes widened with terror when she realized that she was nearing its open mouth. Bloody tears flowed down Barbara's cheeks as she realized that there was no escaping fear. Ronald's head jolted up when he suddenly awoke. He blinked confusedly as he took in his surroundings. The room he was in was a blinding white, and as his eyes adjusted to the light, he realized there were wooden benches lined against the wall. "What am I doing in the football change room?" he muttered to himself, as his hands grazed the bloody floor he sat upon. As he leaned against the wall and sat on the floor, Ronald studied the blood that dripped from his sides. He felt no pain, yet blood continued to seep from underneath his clothes. "Is this my blood?" he whispered, bringing his red-stained fingers up to his eyes. "Yes," a familiar voice said from in front of Ronald. Ronald's breath hitched in his throat as he confusedly lifted his head. Standing in front of him was a boy his age, his light brown hair astray. His ghostly pale skin glimmered in the flickering lights and his gleaming green eyes stared widely at Ronald. A smirk was plastered on his face as he loomed over Ronald, a stance he seemed to enjoy. It was Josh, but at the same time it wasn't. His eyes were unblinking and there was something inhuman about him. Perhaps he was dreaming because the sight in front of him felt like a nightmare he half remembered, but was sure had happened. He just couldn't pinpoint the details. "Josh, is it really you? Because if it is, why aren't we with the others?" Ronald asked, rising to his feet. Josh tilted his head and smiled as he neared Ronald. "What are you talking about? We just fought, remember?" he said innocently. Ronald furrowed his eyebrows with bewilderment. "No, we didn't. Not right now, at least." "Yes, we did," Josh said, sighing and shaking his head. He cupped Ronald's cheeks with his hands and lightly pinched his skin. "I suppose I shouldn't be surprised you don't remember. People like you are prone to that kind of thing." "What do you mean?" Ronald asked, utterly confused. Josh shrugged nonchalantly, as he slowly twisted Ronald's cheek. "Dumb. People like you are prone to being dumb. People like me." Ronald choked in disbelief, his throat suddenly turning dry. Ronald gulped when Josh leaned closer towards him. He dug his long claws in his cheeks with so much force that Ronald felt a vein inside him pop. "People like you," Josh said, nodding as he continued to twist Ronald's skin. "Do you know what they do to people like you?" he asked, widening his eyes and staring up at Ronald sadistically. Ronald shook his head. unsure of what to say or do. Should he beg Josh to stop distracting him and tell him to focus on their mission? Even if he did that, would Josh listen to someone like him? Lynch, Josh breathed, as he placed both hands on Ronald's cheeks and twisted them in opposite directions. They lynch people like you, he whispered, purposely elongating his unsettling words. Josh's slender fingers pressed into the skin of Ronald's cheeks, sharp nails biting in the layer of fine dust, drawing beads of blood. Josh, he whimpered as the pain brought a chill to his veins, the coldness bringing the synapses of his brain to a standstill. They skin people like you. Alive, Josh continued, as he released his grip from Ronald's cheeks and grabbed his broad shoulders. They bury people like you. Alive, he added, shoving Ronald against the bench. Ronald groaned when he collided with the bench. The room spun and he supported his frail body by clutching onto the bench. Josh took Ronald by surprise, and he slowly twisted his body to face him, wincing with every shift. What the hell was that for? He yelled, shooting Josh a glare. Josh chuckled boisterously as he leveled his foot on Ronald's back and shoved him against the bench. Blood spouted from Ronald's mouth as he wailed in agony. They also punched, Josh started, as he landed a blow on Ronald. And beat people like you, he yelled, raining blows on him. A sudden gush of pain jolted throughout Ronald's body. His stomach ached, his arms lost tension and his legs began to weaken. He was locked in place, restricted from defending himself or fighting back. All he could do was allow himself to be trampled over by Josh. Josh turned him over so that he could place his foot on his chest and grip his arms. What are you, Ronald? He asked in a menacing and blaring voice. I don't know, Ronald yelled, trying to kick the ghost off him. It was no use, as this Josh was clinging onto Ronald like a leech. With every fingernail that was piercing into his skin, Ronald felt his blood being sucked in by Josh. What are you, Ronald? He spat with more ferocity this time. His grip around Ronald's arm tightened as the wrath of his words enveloped Ronald. Dirty. The monster in front of him jeeringly grinned, satisfied with that answer. Yes, you're a very dirty person. People like you who are dirty don't deserve the scholarship. They don't deserve pretty girls like Olivia. They don't deserve to be any higher than the second place. Do you know why? Josh asked, his scorching voice causing Ronald's bones to rattle with fear. Ronald blinked away tears and shook his head feebly, as blood leaked from his parted lips. Because that spot is reserved for people like me. A flash of white light could be seen through Carter's clenched eyes. He jerked them open and blinked confusedly, feeling lightheaded and strangely dry. Carter outstretched his arms outwards, confused as to why he couldn't feel the water, despite being enveloped by it. His body was drifting just as it had been before. Carter tested his surroundings and drew a sharp breath. To his surprise, air filled his lungs. Carter didn't waste time questioning it. He swiftly flipped over so that he was parallel to the surface and swam upwards. It wasn't easy to brush aside the hurtful words Jutta said, but the realization that perhaps what happened was paranormal activity eased the load. Carter squinted with determination as the water moved around his limbs in swirls. He moved with robotic precision but organic fluidity, stroke after stroke that was nailed to perfection. He flew through the water, passing by the hurdles the crashing waves brought him. It had been a while since he swam so freely, and it reminded him of the great pleasure his silver medal brought him every time he looked at it. Swimming in water that didn't feel like water was strange for Carter because it felt like he was soaring through the air, something he shouldn't be able to do. Regardless, he continued pushing forward. If he learned anything from these past few weeks, it was that the only way to find out if something was impossible would be to do the impossible. When he finally reached the surface, all the droplets that should have clung on to him suddenly appeared. His damp hair draped over his soaked face and the turquoise fluid splashed against his legs. Carter knitted his eyebrows, but that was as far as he could react before his eyes landed on Jutta. He was still sitting on the ledge, shirtless and grinning. Carter didn't know why he expected the world above the water to change, but it didn't. He was still stuck in the pool room, experiencing paranormal activity. Carter gritted his chattering teeth and lunged forward, grabbing the ledge of the pool. He hauled himself up the steps before Jutta jerked him forward again. I'm not glad you're here, Carter, Jutta repeated, mischief glinting in his eyes. Me neither, Jutta, Carter said firmly, narrowing his gaze at the boy. He avoided looking at his toned chest and stared at his face instead, hoping his expression didn't betray the nervousness he was feeling within. "I'm not glad you're here, Carter," Jutta repeated, except this time his grin loosened slightly, confused as to why his words didn't have the same effect as last time. "Why did you expect me to be? Because you think I have feelings for you. That I love you," he added bitterly, shooting Carter a disgusted look. Carter sucked the chlorinated air and mustered the courage to say what he wanted to say next. It was going to be difficult, he knew, but he had to do it. He had to get out of this trap quickly and return to the real Jutta. "I'm not afraid of you, Jutta. I never was. Rather, I was afraid that I was drifting away from you. I was afraid that you liked the others better than me, that you didn't return my feelings," Carter shakily said, as he placed both of his feet on the step ladder. "At some point, my fear led me to be jealous. Then I realized something," Carter said, regaining his confidence as he stared directly at the imposter. Jutta tilted his head upwards as Carter hovered above him, his hands clutched to the railings of the poolside. The imposter looked small from where Carter was standing, despite them being inches apart. His fear looked minuscule from where Carter was looming overhead. The stance he took truly heightened his courage to fight against the one thing that had been holding him back for years. "I don't fear my fear anymore, Willesden Stevenson. Jutta does love me and he isn't drifting away from me." The clone that was created by Willesden Stevenson shivered at those words, but his shock didn't last long. Carter shoved him aside and jumped over the pool ledge. Freedom and triumph shot up his veins as he turned to smirk at the paranormal being in front of him. Carter grabbed his shoulders and pushed him into the pool, never to be seen again. The moment he crashed into the water, he disintegrated, leaving only trails of dark mist. A genuine smile appeared on Carter's face as the hazy world around him returned to what it was. Jimmy's corpse laid where they had left it and the sidewall returned to its obliterated state. The clear water disappeared and was replaced with its usual murky color, which Carter never thought would relieve him until now. He felt like he had defeated the paranormal activity that had been haunting him for weeks. Perhaps he had, but it was hard to tell. Nevertheless, Carter spun on his heel and ran out of the pool room, shouting with glee, "Thank you, Jutta. Thank you for your help. Stay strong for a little longer because we're coming." Jessica gasped with pure agony as the zombie girl continued to bite her arms. Jessica had no strength left in her to scream, so all she could do was lean against the deformed girl. Her heart slowed its thumping as the immense blood loss was too much of a strain. Suddenly, a blinding white light flashed in her vision, causing her to cry and gasp. At her side, the girl hiccuped and gasped too. It sounded like an attempt at a cry, which perked Jessica's interest. She drowsily turned to look at the girl, whose teeth were digging at her arm, unmoving. Jessica brushed it aside and rested for a moment before another blinding white light slapped her into reality. She peeled herself off the girl when she realized she had stopped biting. The girl's mouth was still plastered on her arm, so it caused a jolt of pain when she moved. However, at this point Jessica was desperate. Plus, she felt like the blinding light was trying to tell her something. She hesitantly backed away, afraid that the zombie girl would lunge at her again and continue biting. A realization suddenly dawned on Jessica during that moment of silence. The girl backed away every time she did. The girl screamed every time she did. The girl cried and gasped every time she did. Bite marks appeared on the girl's arms every time she bit Jessica. It was plainly obvious, and Jessica had to suppress the urge to dwell on why it took her so long to realize. During the moment of stillness, Jessica landed an uppercut on the girl. The moment the girl did the same, Jessica realized how stupid that was of her. She looked down at the bloody girl, who mirrored not only her movements but also her looks. If I fight back, she's going to do the same. If I run, she's going to trail after me. So what if I just do nothing? Jessica took a deep breath and held it in. She stood frozen in her spot and stared at the girl, fighting the urge to run away. Her knees shook and the girl copied her, looking up at her with bulging eyes. After minutes passed, she gripped the ends of her hair and clenched her eyes. Damn it. If I do nothing, nothing is going to happen. Jessica sighed and opened her eyes, still pulling at her hair. She watched as the girl did the same, squirming at the pain. Jessica quietly gasped and pulled harder, causing more cries to escape from both of them. As they pulled at their own hair, Jessica stepped forward. The girl did the same without a thought. She's copying me. She won't know my next move until I do it. Without a moment's hesitation, Jessica released her hair and swiftly slammed the girl against the ground. She stepped on her tiny body before she had time to react and copy her movements. The girl underneath Jessica's feet didn't cry or scream with pain. Instead, she laughed just like Jessica was doing. Jessica grinned and pounded the girl with as much strength as possible, hoping that she could kill her now that she was at a disadvantageous position. As triumph won over Jessica's emotions, she spoke the words that were being whispered into her ears. "I don't fear my fear anymore, Willesden Stevenson," she said, directly to the disintegrating girl. "This girl is portraying my fabricated self that doesn't exist anymore," she continued, as she tilted the girl's trembling face to meet her gaze. "The real Jessica is here, right in front of you." All oxygen and strength were knocked out of Josh. He could only see his mother's peering down at him, repeating the same words. Slowly, black seeped into his vision and he was on the brink of losing consciousness. That was until the darkness was replaced with white. Josh's eyes jerked open because of the strength of the light. He gasped, but no air entered his lungs because Judith and Susan still had their hands tightly gripped around his throat. His eyes darted between their gleaming faces, looking for an opening to escape. They had their hands on his throat, their knees interlocked between his legs and the sides of their bodies against his numb arms. There was no way to break free, yet he felt a sudden surge and impulse to fight back. He was reminded of their motives, the reason why he and his friends were fighting. Not only for Jimmy, not only for Jutta, but also for their lives. So he realized he couldn't die today. Especially not because of his mother's. Josh clenched his arms and used as much strength as he could muster to wiggle his arms from their weight. He managed to squirm free after a couple of minutes, which drained all the energy he had left. His mothers didn't notice his freed arms because all they could do was bare their teeth at him and repeat the same chants. Josh's throat was dry at this point, so he instinctively brought his hands to his throats. He attempted to peel their hands off his throat, but they were glued. Josh sighed inwardly and dropped his head, as the darkness seeped into his vision again. "I don't want to die. I still have so much I need to do. I need to apologize to Ronald. I need to give the scholarship to Ronald. I need to apologize to Olivia. I need to apologize to Jutta. I need to. Josh's eyes jerked open again as the blinding white light entered his vision once more. "I need to fight if I want to live to apologize," he inwardly exclaimed. He swiftly curled his hands around their wrists that happened to loosen at that moment. Josh was smarter than to believe it was just a coincidence. It had to either be Jutta from the other side or a greater entity. No matter what it was, he grabbed their wrists and sat up, slamming his mother's to the ground with all the strength that suddenly returned to his body. Josh jumped up before they could crawl up his legs again. Before he completely ran away from the scene, he peered down at his groaning mothers. During this moment of hesitation, they groggily sat up, preparing to lunge at Josh again. Josh backed away slowly before he shouted at them. "I don't fear my fear anymore, Willesden Stevenson," he yelled, which startled the women. They peered up at him with confusion, before the realization hit them. "Of course I know it's you controlling the paranormal activity, so stop acting surprised. I thought we already discussed that." The women gritted their teeth and stomped towards Josh, who simply smirked at them in response. "I'm afraid of a lot of things, like regretting something I didn't do or say for the rest of my life. But I'm not afraid of you two anymore," he proclaimed proudly. "And just so you know, I'm on my way to overcoming that regret. Wait and watch me," Josh exclaimed, swiftly turning to run out of the gymnasium. As he ran, he glanced over his shoulder and watched as the two female monsters disintegrated. Olivia weakly rolled her head skyward, staring mindlessly into the dark abyss of the detention closet. The therapist was tracing his lips on every inch of her skin, clinging onto her like a leech. Olivia shed silent tears, as despair and hopelessness found her once again. They felt like her only friends, and perhaps they were since she met them so often. She knew that what was happening was paranormal activity, but that didn't mean it wasn't real. What was happening to her was real, and it didn't matter whether the therapist in front of her was one of Willesden Stevenson's creation. It was still happening. The only option Olivia had was to let it happen and wait for it to finish. And she didn't know if it would ever end. She counted the number of times this had happened or almost happened to her. Once when she was 13, a second time a couple of weeks ago, a third time an hour ago, and a fourth time now. What a pitiful life I've lived, she repeated in her head, using her remorse as a distraction. Fortunately for her, another distraction came. A blinding white light filled the darkened room. She wondered whether it was in her head or something real. It was difficult to define the lines between reality and her nightmares these days. The white light disappeared and Olivia pouted her lips. "Don't leave me like everyone else," she said inwardly, as the man continued to touch her. "Come back," she thought, closing her eyes as the therapist cupped her cheeks and leaned forward. Olivia jerked her head up and her eyes flew open. In a swift second, she raised her hands and slapped the man. It was an impulse. It was an act of defense. But most importantly, it was a realization. A realization that her arms and legs were free, unlike the first and second time. And it was another realization that this was not her fault and now was not the time to die, just like the third time. The slap took both of them by surprise, but Olivia used the moment to swiftly stand up. The therapist jumped up and grabbed her arm, hissing at her to count to 3 and take a deep breath. Olivia was thankful for the compact room because she was able to outstretch her free arm and grab the locked door. She desperately shook it, to no avail. The therapist jerked her arm so that she staggered backwards and fell into his grip. Olivia grunted and stomped on his feet, which caused him to let go of his grip for a split second. She swiftly grabbed the doorknob again and to her surprise, it opened this time. Without batting an eyelash, she pushed the door open and ran out of the closet. She slammed the wooden door behind her and found herself in Mrs. Briggs's science class. Olivia grinned with satisfaction as she locked the door and pressed her ear against it, listening to the desperate cries of the therapist. "I don't fear my fear anymore, Wilson Stevenson," she yelled, and she knew he could hear her through the thin walls. "The darkness and the unknown are nothing compared to the monsters I have defeated during my life." With that, the paranormal delusions disappeared and she ran towards her friends. Bloody tears flowed down Barbara's cheeks when she realized that there was no escaping fear. Or was there? She was inches away from the enormous spider's mouth when a blinding white light knocked her into thinking with sense. Wilson Stevenson used the paranormal activity to target their darkest fears and manifest them into a form that could haunt them. She and her friends knew and understood that. But what would happen if they overcame their darkest fear? Barbara clenched her eyes shut as her skin touched the insides of the spider's mouth. There was no time to think. There was only time to act. She knew there wasn't much to do, mid-air and nearing a monster's wide-open mouth. However, she realized that she already overcame her fear. She already stood up to Olivia and spilled her true feelings. All there was left to do was to confront her fear that was manifested into the form of a spider. Hope in the form of a ray of white light shone on her when she realized that part was the simplest of all, and it was something she could do now. "I don't fear my fear anymore, Wilson Stevenson," Barbara yelled directly at the spider. The spider halted the moment she screamed, widening its inscrutable eye sockets with surprise. "Didn't you already see with your abilities? Jessica and I confronted Olivia, and now I'm confronting this stupid spider." She was about to continue until the spider shrunk slightly. Barbara jumped at this sudden shift in height and clutched onto its legs that were still wrapped around her. She widened her eyes with surprise and opened her mouth to continue yelling. "I don't know what's going on with you right now, but I think you should keep your guard up because Jutta is doing something to help me. Actually, continue this failure of a method you're performing because we're going to defeat you anyways," she screamed as the spider shrunk more significantly this time. Her feet finally touched the ground, but the spider was still the size of a hound. "Go die a rotten death in hell, Wilson Stevenson. You can try and use the same paranormal activity against me for as long as you like, but just know that the result will be the same every time," she confidently yelled, and finally, the monster released its grip from her waist and shrunk to the size of a normal spider. "Unlike you, humans have the ability to overcome their fears." The spider shrunk to the size of dust, and after a victorious stomp from Barbara, her fear disintegrated. Then she straightened her back and ran through the hallways, this time with a secure direction of where she was going. "Die, Ronald," the ghost Josh hissed, as he continued to beat Ronald's face into pulp. "People like you deserve to die." Ronald wanted to fight back, but he simply couldn't. This Josh had too much power over him and Ronald was at a disadvantage. He was always at a disadvantage, he realized. So much so that he was used to it at this point. So much so that the blinding white light that entered his vision did nothing but remind Ronald of Josh's white skin. What would he gain if he did decide to fight back? If he did decide to punch that sadistic smirk off Josh's face? Perhaps nothing. He could gain nothing but more blows from Josh. But there was a possibility he could gain something. Freedom. Ronald grudgingly grabbed Josh's foot that was on his chest and harshly lifted it off. He hauled himself up using the wooden bench behind him and stared at the imposter's ghastly face. There was a possibility he could gain freedom if he fought back, and Ronald chose to take the risk. Before Josh could yell at Ronald for provoking him, Ronald raised his fist in the air. Josh widened his eyes and clenched his fist in response, preparing to fight him. Ronald stood frozen in his spot and willed his fist to move, but it didn't. Josh stared at Ronald with confusion, before grinning and approaching him to easily take the upper hand. Ronald swallowed the lump in his throat as the blinding white light entered his vision again, and a breeze rushed by his ears. Violence wasn't the solution, it said, its voice reminiscent of Jutta's gentle tone. Josh was about to beat him until Ronald grabbed his shoulders to stop him. He knew this Josh wasn't real, that it was just a fragment of his paranormal activity, but he spoke to him anyways. "I don't fear my fear anymore, Wilson Stevenson," Ronald whispered to the ghost. "I received my conclusion with Josh. I accepted the fact that he will be number one and that I'll be number two. And frankly, I don't care anymore. Life isn't about stupid rankings like that. Life isn't about stupid achievements like scholarships that divide rather than unite people," he said, releasing his grip from his shoulder. "Besides, I know that just because I'm second place in someone's eyes doesn't mean I have to revolve my identity around that," Ronald added, his strength returning to his weakened limbs. "I also know that I have dark skin and it's something I cannot change. That does not mean I'm dirty. If anything, you're the dirty one, Wilson Stevenson." Ronald inhaled the air that wasn't as thick as it was before. That was all he wanted to say, so he calmly walked out of the change room. He glanced back once, to watch the ghost disintegrate without another word. When he shut the change room door behind him, he found himself in the gymnasium. Ronald rushed towards the exit as soon as his eyes landed on Josh, who was going the same way. "The real Josh. Josh," Ronald called, taking long strides to catch up to him. Josh quickly spun around and his expression lit with genuine relief when he saw Ronald. His giddy face reminded Ronald of their faces during those sunny days in the neighborhood park, as they tossed a football at each other. His heart wrenched with nostalgia and he discreetly wiped a tear that rolled down his cheeks. Growing up was painful, but not as painful as growing apart. "Ronald, you're here. You're here," Josh exclaimed, lightly grabbing his arm and running out the door with him. "I am," Ronald chuckled, momentarily unsettled by the resemblance Josh had with the ghost. "Let's forget about everything and find the others, okay? Right now, we need to focus on living."